II was both a war and a crime. Millions of innocent people were killed, and millions more lost their homes and property. The victims cried out for justice. Those who brought this suffering must be made to answer for their crimes.
After World War I, the Allies had decided in the peace treaty that people accused of war crimes should be tried. And one of the many concessions made to the Germans after the First World War was a change which the Allies had agreed to in the Versailles Treaty, that the Germans would try these criminals themselves. Well, that proved an absolute and total fiasco. And the Allies were not about to try that a second time.
Near the end of the war, the Allies organized a War Crimes Commission and set up a system for bringing criminals to justice. The commission decided that individuals who committed atrocities against persons or property would return for trial near the scene of their crime. Individuals accused of specific crimes, like killing prisoners of war or downed airmen, would be brought before military courts. An international tribunal would try the major war criminals, Hitler and the men of his inner circle. But Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazis committed suicide before they could be arrested.
The notion that there ought to be a trial under international law took hold and was really exemplified by Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson, who took leave from our Supreme Court and strongly advocated running a trial, which in my view had lots of merit, because if nothing else, it was going to establish, forgetting the legal aspects of it, it was going to establish the Nazi record in an indelible fashion.
The first of 13 Nuremberg trials commenced 6 months after the war ended. In November 1945, American Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson arrived in Germany with the hope that the trials would destroy the lingering attraction of Nazi ideology forever.
Also there in Nuremberg was today's guest, Werner von Rosenstiel. He was born in Germany in 1911. He was educated there, where he studied law and became a member of the German Bar Association and the German Wehrmacht. He emigrated to the United States, where he met his wife, Anne, became a U.S. citizen, graduated from Fordham Law School, became a member of the Florida Bar Association, drafted into the U.S. Army, and after the war saw him sent to Nuremberg.
The most important of the Nazi conspirators was Hermann Goering, who had been Hitler's number 2. Goering was indicted on all 4 counts, from planning aggressive war to crimes against humanity.
First, did you proclaim the Nuremberg laws?
Als Reichstagspräsident, jawohl.
Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
In preparation for the cross-examination of Hermann Goering by Robert Jackson, the case was assisted by Whitney Harris, who was with us last October, and assisting Whitney Harris was Werner von Rosenstiel, who interpreted for Hermann Goering while being interrogated in this preparation for the trial. Also, he encountered Albert Speer and other top Nazis when Werner was assigned to Robert H. Jackson's staff. On October 19th, 1945, as final preparations were being made for the trial, the actual indictments had to be served on the defendants. Werner von Rosenstiel contacted Major Neve of the British delegation and assisted him in the service of these indictments on many of the 21 defendants in the dock. He assisted Major Neve in interpreting what was transpiring to these German defendants.
We'll start with this one.
I hope I shan't make a balls of it.
Do just fine, old chap. Open up.
Good morning. I am Major Neve. I'm the officer appointed by the International Military Tribunal to serve upon you.
Wait. You're British?
I am.
Finally, a civilized man. Neve. What is your given name?
Airy.
Major Airy Neve. I have heard this name before. Airy, like the wind. Why would I have heard this name?
I was captured, tortured by the Gestapo, and escaped twice.
Ah, I see. You've earned your given name.
I am the officer appointed by the International Military Tribunal to serve upon you a copy of the indictment in which you are named as defendant. I am also here to advise you as to your rights to counsel.
I care nothing for lawyers.
On the second day of the trial, Jackson stood before the court and delivered the opening statement on behalf of the international team of prosecutors.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
Was at the opening statement presented by Robert Jackson, and he wrote, "Throughout the 2 hours in which Jackson presented the overview of the prosecution's case, I was glued to my seat listening to the greatest speech that I had ever heard. I had seen the great orators of my time, Hitler, Goebbels, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Never before or since has an American judge or lawyer stated more persuasively what justice is all about." After the war, our guest returned back to the States and became an advertising executive. However, at age 60, he returned to his first love, the law, which he practiced in his own firm in Philadelphia and as a partner in a law firm in Germany. Throughout the years, Werner von Rosenstiel has become a dynamic speaker. He's lectured widely to university students in Bonn, Heidelberg, Philadelphia, and South Florida, and recently addressed judges of the German Constitutional Court. He lives in St. Petersburg with his wife Anne and is a prolific writer, including his most recent book, Tales of an American Soldier. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Werner von Rosenstiel.
The most tragic picture that was ever taken about what happened to Germany. And you say, what in the hell is that? Well, let me explain it to you. The picture was taken in March of 1933. Hitler had been in power since January 30th, 1933. So, by my calculation, he had been in power about a month. And he was totally and completely in control of Germany at that time. And who put him into that position? This man. Who is this man? He was known to every German. He was the idol of my youth. His name was Paul von Hindenburg. Who was Paul von Hindenburg? He, at the age of 60, saved Germany from the first invasion of the Russians at the beginning of World War I. He was drafted, suddenly he was already retired, and the the Kaiser said, bring Hindenburg in, he can do it. And he was given 2 divisions that were yanked out of the Western Front, a very good commanding officer for his staff, a fellow by the name of Ludendorff. And these 2, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, produced the miracle of defeating 2 Russian armies and pushing the Russians back and ultimately finishing the Russians off. And he was elected at the age of about 75, first to the office of Chancellor of German President, when the first president of Germany had died in 1925, and he was re-elected in 1932 to the office, and this picture was taken when the man was 86 years old. Imagine ruling a nation of 70 million people and being 86 years old. Well, I'm 5 years older, but I'll tell you, I'm in much better shape than Hindenburg was. Many people said that very often he talked like this. He was barely capable of doing anything, but he wore the uniform in a manner that was so impressive that the people said, the man has so many orders and so many decorations. He got to be a great man, and he got to be great. And here he is. And on this day, Joseph Goebbels and Hitler had cooked up a story that was so immensely appealing to the Germans. What had he done? He said, we are going to have a big convocation of today's Germany in Potsdam. Potsdam was the place, was the sort of the Mount Vernon of Germany. That is where the tradition of Prussia had been buried. There was the funeral place of Frederick the Great and his great father. They were buried there, and now they were going to celebrate that they had found the successor to the greatest of all Prussian kings. And here was Hitler, who was handing the heritage of Frederick the Great and his great father over to the new hero of Germany, to Adolf Hitler. And everybody was overwhelmed by this thing. An idiot gave it to the most cunning man in Europe. The man was senile. He died a few years later, a year and a half later. And it's a tragic thing when you look what one picture can tell you about the past of Germany. And Hitler was a magic person, make no mistake about it. He needed an audience. Without an audience, he was totally uninteresting. He was not terribly persuasive, but the moment he had a big audience, he mesmerized the people. He mesmerized the people in a manner that you say, well, tell us how can you describe that? Yes, indeed, I can. In 1938, I was working as a law clerk in a bank in Berlin, and at the end of, it must have been March, there was suddenly, when I came into the bank, the bells rang and said, we are all forming in front of the bank in rows of 4, and we are going to march over to the Chancery on the Wilhelmstrasse, and there will be a spontaneous reception for the Führer, who has returned from Austria, which is now part of Germany. So we marched over a spontaneous route that was mapped out for us to the place in front of the Chancery. And there was a spontaneous roped-off area for the Berliner Handelsgesellschaft. It was astonishing to see how little space you needed to put 250 employees into the space. I would say it is would have been the space from that pole to that pole, and this here, 250 would easily fit in, there would be space. But it was tight to some extent, and sometimes it was very pleasurable. It depended upon with whom you stood. And I, being still relatively young, I was blessed with having a very attractive, somewhat older woman next to me, and I was charmed by her presence and not particularly interested in Hitler, whom I despised, but I was very successful in hiding my dislike of Hitler, because that was a dangerous thing to do. If you didn't raise your hand and spoke loudly Heil Hitler, you were always suspected as being against him, and this was a dangerous thing to do in Germany. And so I had this young woman, not slightly older than I was, but still very young, woman next to me, and very pleasant, and we talked about how this now took place, and here we had a perfect presentation of how to raise excitement, because this was all programmed by Dr. Goebbels, and it started with slide music, familiar tunes, more tunes, then interruption, and you heard something from an opera, most likely a Wagnerian opera. And ultimately it became more and more intensive. And then there was the announcement, the Führer has just descended from the plane at the Tempelhof airfield. He enters his car, and it is now coming from the Kreuzberg down to the Wilhelmstraße, and he comes down. And I look at my warm next partner, and while she had been listening to my stories before, she was totally gone. She was not with me in the least. Her idol was coming up the street. She didn't look very attractive. Her eyes were open, her pupils were dilated, there were sweat pearls on her upper lip. Her hat was pushed back, and she was mesmerized from the impression of the idol that slowly came in the car and drove. And I looked around, and I was surrounded by people who were all in this state of mesmerization. They were all absolutely captivated. It was not just she, it was everybody. Do you think that she remembered this scene? Would you like to know? I presume you would. In 1945, I went with my commanding officer to Berlin, because we wanted to explore what could be still seen in Berlin. And there were many strange things that we saw and experienced, but perhaps the strangest was that when we went to the Chancellery, and I said, this is where we stood in that small area, and I looked up there to the Chancellery, and there was the balcony where Hitler had spoken, and he suddenly said, would you remember how you got here from the bank? I said, certainly, let's get in the Jeep. We drive back to the bank. And lo and behold, the bank is standing there just perfect. Apparently, they knew that I was coming and would see it. Yeah. And so they had saved it from the bombardment. It was perfect. It was nothing had changed. So I went to the door. I used to go in. I pressed the button, and I heard the ringing inside of the portal. There was no answer. I rang a second time with more force, and suddenly I heard steps coming to the door. The door opened, and I see Francie, the girl who had stood next to me at the occasion. And her mouth half open, she looks at me and said, Herr von Rosenstiel. Then she slammed the door. But that was my return to Berlin, and it gave me another memory of the time how Hitler mesmerized the people. Because this woman, and she undoubtedly knew when she saw me, she saw the same thing that I had seen, how she had been mesmerized by this magic man who had a talent to turn people's head so that they had looked in the other direction. This is something that we must never forget, that the man had qualities that fortunately come only every few hundred years. Napoleon was one of them. I do not know whether there were many in the 20th century who had this ability. But the magic is something with which I think the world must always count, because it can perform miracles that are almost unbelievable. And here is a story that would probably make a good account to explain to you in a different way. In 1937, Hitler was very much already involved with doing something about the future of Germany. And he called into his office a number of people, namely Hermann Göring, Admiral Raeder, General von Fritsch of the army, and von Neurath, his foreign secretary. He called them into his office, and the recording secretary was a Colonel Hosbach. And he said, "It is my unalterable desire and decision to take Poland on and recapture for Germany the area of Poland that separates Germany from East Prussia." Because in the Treaty of Versailles, as you may perhaps know, Germany was suddenly changed in a very substantial way. The Allies took out a broad so-called corridor that was made Poland, and that gave Poland an access to the Baltic Sea and separated East Prussia from Germany at large. And Hitler and all Germans, including me, were furious about this particular event. And the interesting thing about this is nobody knew this, but Hitler then went to East Prussia and talked to the Germans in East Prussia about the criminality of having been separated from Germany proper by the corridor. And there is a book that contains the pictures that shows the German audiences as they were absolutely mesmerized, applauding him as he speaks. I found this book. A man gave it to me after I'd given a lecture on Vashon Island just outside of Seattle in a school. And the teacher there said, "You know, we have a funny book and nobody knows what it is." And he let me see it, and I saw it. Here was a proof conclusive that Hitler had gone there and to persuade other people had had it all photographed for the purpose of organizing something which was very risky. And what do you think happened? In 1945, we found the protocol that Hosbach had written. He had been promoted in the meantime to the rank of general, and he was one of the witnesses at the Nuremberg trials. And he said, these people were there. There was Neurath, there was Göring, there was Raeder. And they did nothing when he said, "I will take it." And this became one of the key issues of the Nuremberg trials on which Justice Jackson built his case. And so I think I've now given you a sufficient background of what Hitler was like, and unless you want to have more about it, I think I should come really to the topic of what you are interested in, namely Justice Jackson, because we are here to honor Justice Jackson. And Justice Jackson became, in due course, sort of the idol of my own life. And the first time I ever saw this man, to me, he was just another man. He had just been appointed to the Supreme Court. I mean, there were always justices being appointed to the Supreme Court, some guy, some retire, and then others get on the court, and so he was just another man. And then comes the astonishing day, namely December 7, 1941, and I have been converted overnight, along with many Japanese and Italians, an enemy alien, a German enemy alien. And I was a little bit, more than a little bit nervous. What were they going to do with me? Were they going to pick me up immediately and send me into a concentration camp? Maybe. I did not know. I mean, this was something new. And then we read in the paper that there was going to be a big meeting of the American Civil Liberties Union. And the people who had raised this arrangement and developed it were two people, namely Eleanor Roosevelt and Justice Robert Jackson, the newest justice on the Supreme Court. Well, I immediately, my wife and I bought tickets, and we went to the Wall of Astoria, and I saw Justice Jackson there for the first time. I had seen Eleanor Roosevelt several times before me. She was always speaking about something, but I did not know that Justice Jackson now had entered the public domain, so to speak. But he spoke with great persuasion and said, you know, we are going to develop all the necessary measures that none of the enemy aliens can do harm to America. But we are not going to engage in the stupidities that were permitted to be done at the beginning of World War I, when in their excitement to be really tough on the Germans, they renamed sauerkraut into Liberty cabbage. This was encouraging. It was the first time that I'd heard Justice Jackson make a very pertinent remark, and I think very much to the point. And he said, we are going to look you all up. We look you up where you are, and now stay where you are. We will come to you. We will find out whether you are to be trusted or not. And we are going to develop a technique of speaking to people who must be, if necessary, arrested and put behind bars. And so sometime in October of 1941, the FBI appeared at my doorstep, and I was coming back from law school. It was kind of late. It was 9:30 in the evening. And when I entered my apartment, there were two FBI agents sitting there with my wife, and they said, welcome, and we would like now to search your apartment. I said, please be my guest. Do you mind if I quickly eat a little bit of supper with my wife? No, you can do that. We will look at the apartment. And so they went through it, and they found astonishing things in my apartment that very much surprised them, and it was a copy of Mein Kampf. And, they confronted me with it and said, you had a copy of your Mein Kampf? I said, yes, indeed, I have it. And I bought it in 1933 when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. And well, why did you? Well, I said, I anticipated being a law clerk, a law student at the time, that in the coming examinations for the first bar examination, I would be asked about the ideas of the man who had just assumed control of Germany. And so I read the book from cover to cover, and you can see It's totally annotated from page 1 to the last page. Oh, they said, that's interesting. I said, that's the way it is. And he said, why did you keep it? Well, I said, it's an interesting memento for me. Oh. And I said, why should I throw it away? Because you would say, he threw it away. Or I could have bought myself a copy here, and then you would think there is nothing wrong with a bad translation that I could have bought on 14th Street. Where I live. So they were kind of a little bit rattled, but they found nothing else. They went through all of my shirts and my underwear and everything to see whether I had a pistol or so. And I was completely clean. On the day of December 7th, I had immediately taken or sent my wife with our radio to the people from whom I bought it and said, yank out of my radio anything that would enable me to listen to anything from Europe or so. I just want to have the local people to speak to me. And they did this at a tree. I said, please give me a receipt and write in the receipt precisely what you have done, because the FBI is going to come and ask me, are you listening? And I said, yes, but not to the distant world. I'm only listening to New York. And so they took me and questioned me all night, and then they released me and said, in a few days you will get orders to appear before an enemy-aided hearing board. And at this occasion, I then had a wonderful experience, because the board was very, very tough, because the FBI was absolutely convinced that I was a dangerous person, that I was a spy or something, because after all, I had been an exchange student in 1935, 1936 at the University of Cincinnati. I had not gone directly back to Germany. On the contrary, I wanted to make contacts worldwide. I had been in Japan, Korea, Manchuria, China, Singapore, every place. I had worked on a German ship. This ship had taken me all over the Indonesian area. I had been, there were entries in my passport that I had been ashore in many of these places. I was clearly, then I had gone back. I had been drafted into the German, I had been drafted into the German army. I'd taken examinations there and finally qualified for a job in the German judicial administration. I had to be a spy. And finally, fortunately for me, one of the men, when the FBI just brazenly said to me, you know, you made propaganda in Cincinnati about Hitler. And I said, no, I didn't. I was a student. I studied about America. And the man said, interrupted and said, do you by any chance remember anything that you had done at the University of Cincinnati? I said, I remember a great deal. I thought it was a very interesting time. And at the end, the Department of Political Science asked me to give a lecture about the reasons for the collapse of the German municipalities at the end of World War II. And he said, do you remember anything about that? Oh, I said, certainly. Would you like to hear it? And so I said, I gave it as a lecture only a few years ago. And I remember very detailed. And so we get involved in a totally academic discussion. And finally, the other two judges say, you know, this has absolutely nothing to do with what we want to find out. And the man smiles at them, smiles at me and says, I'm sorry, I got off the track, I'm sorry. Please proceed and turn again to the FBI. But this time the FBI has lost their wind. They were dead there. There was nothing that they wanted to ask anymore. And they said, please present your witnesses. And I called on the first, my wife, and my wife had that wonderful letter that she had saved. She was a pack rat. She did not throw away a letter that I ever wrote to her. I have them all. And I have thousands of letters. And she brought it, and it was still in the envelope. And she read it out aloud, and she said, you know, he disliked the system and was ashamed of what happened there. And I believed him, and that's all I can say. And then she sat down. And then at the end, they said, well, we have to think about your case. It will be about 2 weeks, and then you will be informed what we are going to do with you. And we said, thank you very much. And walked out. It was midnight. And 2 weeks later, I got word I'd been paroled in the custody of one of our closest friends who was a witness for me at the same occasion. And now I was sort of a free man because I needed only 3 more months. And by that time, I could finish my law school. I'd take my bar exam and have the privilege of being drafted into the United States Army. And now, of course, begins for me the exciting time where I begin to get closer and closer to my idol. My idol has disappeared in the past in my own involvement with this thing. Now I'm an American soldier, and I think I have great things waiting for me. Well, it was primarily KP. I was I became an expert at it and found out very quickly that it was not necessarily an evil to be a KP, because you could also make friends with the men in the kitchen. And I think the important men in the kitchen are, of course, the cooks. And so I always found ways of being interested in their jobs. And they thought, well, what would you like to know? I said, I am astonished how little you know about the possibilities of what you could have in your own army cooking. And they said, oh, tell me what? I said, have you ever heard of beefsteak tartare? No. What is that? Well, I said, that you have to order from the quartermaster really good beef. That's the first thing. And then you have to grind it down, and then you must order capers and raw eggs and a couple of other things. And with that, you can make beefsteak tartare. And all you need a couple of bottles of beer, and I'll tell you, have a luncheon that is absolutely superb. Well, I did no longer do the grease trap or do the miserable jobs in the places where I was employed. I learned that you have to get along with people, that you have to see what interests them. And I had an ever-increasing wonderful time in the Army, and suddenly I find myself at the end of the war with a commission as a second lieutenant. Because my commanding officer said, you shouldn't be sitting around as an enlisted man. You cannot do anything really significant. You ought to have a commission. And by the time the war is over, I get the commission. I'm sent to Paris, and from Paris, suddenly there is a new wind blowing. And what is the wind that is blowing? They have gotten the man to nail the German government that was arrested. And this man was Justice Jackson. He had been appointed in May of 1945 and given to overrule anybody who was in his way. And he was a master who did this in a way that the people whom he overruled sort of liked it, because they were made part of it all. And here it became quite apparent, because suddenly, while I was sitting in Paris and having nothing to do and seeing wonderful films about the times, I suddenly was yanked out and sent to Fürstenhagen, where there were the files of the German Ministry of Justice. And my orders were, find something that can nail anybody who probably could be hanged because he was close to Hitler. And what do I find? I find the orders that Keitel and Jodl had signed to shoot down Allied troops that had raised their hands and said, I surrender. This was a violation of the Hague Convention of 1907, which had been signed by Germany. And if the Department of Justice, the German Department of Justice, had done their job, they would have called up Keitel and Jodl and said, don't issue the order. You are putting your head into a noose. They are going to hang you. They filed it. They filed it, and I found it, and I sent it to Wiesbaden, where all the materials for the trial were collected. And then suddenly I appeared in Wiesbaden myself, and I met a man who had witnessed the horrible events of an execution of a whole ghetto in the Ukraine shortly after Germany had taken over the Ukraine. And the man had come into my office and was very hesitant to speak, but I loosened them up, gave him a cigarette and talked to him. And so finally he began to tell me the story, and the story was absolutely, I was shocked. He told me essentially the story of Schindler's List, because he was working for a German company in the Ukraine that was building big facilities and used Jewish craftsmen as the basic force to produce the projects for the German army. And he found out that within the next day, the whole ghetto was going to be liquidated. And that would have meant that his men who slept in the ghetto every night would be executed along with the whole ghetto. And he went to the Gestapo and said, you cannot do this to me because I will be without workers and I cannot do the job for the German army. And they said, keep your men out for a day because we are going to liquidate the ghetto tomorrow. So he kept them in his place for the night. And the next morning, when the execution started, he went there and saw it and described it to me precisely as it is displayed in the famous picture that all of you have seen, which is Schindler's List. Only this one was Graby's list, so to speak. And I translated it. He came after after a couple of weeks. He came. He was a man with a real sense for writing and really bringing out what was important, what he saw. He had he delivered by thinking you must have concrete, specific detail for everything that you say so that the person who reads it can pick up the essentials. And I knew when I made the translation that it would be one of the most dramatic things that would ever be appearing at any trial, and it was. If you go over the trial records or see the records, in every book, in every brief on the trial, this particular passage, these passages of Graby will appear. And then I suddenly find that I have been transferred to Nuremberg, and on the very first day, whom do you think I see walking to the courthouse? Justice Jackson. And just yesterday, Gregory showed us a film, and in that film there was a picture which shows Justice Jackson getting off a plane and arriving in Nuremberg. And he wore the same coat that he wore when I saw him walk into the courtroom. It was wonderful. I suddenly knew what the guy looked like. I'd forgotten that I'd seen him in the distance at the border of Astoria. And now I saw him, and of course, I came into an operation that was running like a high-class machine. Everything was provided, but there was no dilly-dallying anymore. Everybody was on high gear. And already on the first day when I came in, I got a passport specially made for me with a picture which said that I could go any place I wanted, that I could examine everybody, request help and whatnot. And with that, I could also get all the tickets that I wanted. I could sit in in the VIP lounge and watched from there what was going on at the trial. In the meantime, the Palace of Justice was still a shambles. There were masons there putting walls back and taking walls out because there was created an arena for the world where there would be at one time something like 250 or 300 people. And what was done for these people? Imagine each one of them had a set of earphones and had a small widget there on which he could determine which language he wanted to hear. English, French, Russian, and German, 4 languages. But what was it? All the message that got into this system went to everybody. There were the judges, there was the defendants, there were all the attorneys, and there was the vast, vast number of the press, and there were a large number of Germans that were reserved. It was reserved for Germans to see what was being done to the people whom only 6 months ago they had saluted with loud Heil Hitler. And you cannot imagine what kind of a theater had been created. I'll tell you, there was floodlight that would make this room like a dark room. I mean, it was glare, and you could see everything. If Goering scratched his nose, also, you could see it. It was, everything was visible. It was a tremendous thing. And the excitement of being involved with this, everybody took their wheel to it. And so finally we knew on the 21st on the 18th of October, there was the day on which the indictments were going to be served to the defendants. And there was one thing I should tell you before, because I had a chance to be a guest at one of the dinner parties of Jackson's. Now, I did not belong into the class who were communicating with Jackson. Those were generals. They were very important people like Colonel Eamon, who had finished up Dutch Schultz in his day and finished, you may not remember this, but he had a company called Murder Incorporated in New York, and for $25,000 he would bump off anybody who wanted to pay $25,000. But Colonel Eamon was always welcome, and of course Colonel Story, his main assistant. But there were many, many people with high rank, but there was never a second lieutenant. And how did I manage to get in? Well, my commanding officer was that day in Prague, and I was sitting there peacefully in our office in the Palace of Justice when the telephone rings, and it is the secretary of Colonel Fairman, Colonel Charles Fairman, who was the liaison officer between the Judge Advocate General in Paris and Justice Jackson. And she said, you know, I have here before me an invitation for Colonel Fairman and me to go to a dinner party at Justice Jackson's that he had invited us. And Colonel Fairman has just called me. He cannot come. He has to stay in Paris and hold the hand of General Betz. And now I'm missing the chance of going to a party with Justice Jackson. And I am heartbroken, and I have already called the secretary of Justice Jackson and said, could you do me a great favor? Could I come if I find an escort? She said, sure. But she said, it's most likely going to be only your lieutenant. But she said, it's okay. So she said, will you come? I said, yes, I will. Yes, I will. And of course, I polished my shoes and cleaned everything up, very nice. My uniform was not nearly as elegant as all of these people with lots of stuff here and there, but I got there and I was in the reception line. I shook Justice Jackson's hand. I was very pleased to see him, but very close to listen. It was a wonderful, groaning board from which we took the most elegant food. And then there was, the moment the eating was over, the women were at one side and the men went to the other side. And what the women did, I do not know, but I know what the men did. We came to the real stuff. And the real stuff was strong and effective. And in a very short time, we were all well liquored up. So we need each other for support, so it's in the way. And I stand in a big circle, and next to me is Colonel Andrews. Colonel Andrews is the famous commander of the prisons. And here he is to my right, Colonel Andrews, this famous man who has about 1,500 Nazi high wicks in under his thumb. And I, likable man, I thought I was required, certainly a remarkable man. And he looks at me, bloodshot eyes, and said, "A bunch of jerks, that's what they are." Well, that was, in a sense, a very bad way for him to identify how an American looked at these Germans, because it was very obvious to me at that moment that he did not realize how cunning, how deceptive, how dangerous these people were, and that you could not trust them with anything. It was not good enough that you, for example, when they were convicted, let them go back to their own cells. There are reasons that people have developed in the American system of penal justice. When somebody is convicted to die, he goes generally out and is put before an X-ray screen to see whether he has anything on him with which he can take his life. And he is never brought back to the cell in which he lived. He goes to a cell in which there is nothing, absolutely nothing, maybe a board on which he can sleep for the last night. They didn't do anything like that. Colonel Andrews had not learned his lesson that these people were dangerous people, horrible people. And now I'm there the next day or a few days later, and I interpret for the service of the indictment. There was a big stack of indictments sitting on Major Neve's desk, and as the defendants came in, he told them, this is the indictment, you have 30 days to prepare yourself for the trial, and the trial will start on November 21st. And most of them took the document, turned around, and were walked back to their cell. The only one who spoke up was Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht said, "I resent being served with an indictment because I'm obviously not guilty. And the only reason you are serving me with the indictment, you want to acquit me and then later on claim that it was a fair trial." And Major Neve said, "Take the indictment and go back to your cell." And so he did go. And 7 years later, I was on a plane, and guess who's sitting next to me? Mrs. Schacht, and opposite from me sits Schacht, who is already asleep when the plane takes off. And I then turned around to Mrs. Schacht and said, "Mrs. Schacht, you know, I met your husband once under rather peculiar circumstances when the indictment for the Nuremberg trials was served on him." And he said, and she said, "You did?" I said, "Yes, I did." And she reaches over and says, "Puppy, wake up." And Puppy wakes up, and she explains who I am. And she looks at me and she said, "What did I say to him?" And I told what he had said. She said, "See, I was right. I was right. I was acquitted. So he went back. This is, and now comes for me the great moment where my never-ending admiration for Justice Jackson is planted, and it is the Monday after the indictments have been served, there is Justice Jackson's staff conference. And the staff conference is an affair. There's a big group, there are 125 people, and here sits Justice Jackson there, flanked to the left by Colonel Story, his Chief of Staff for Legal Affairs, and to the right, a general who provides all the things that may be needed, whether this is a new typewriter or whether this is this or that. But it was all still very primitive in many ways. And Justice Jackson says, well, what's up, Colonel Story? And Colonel Story says, well, we received a petition from the Defense Counsel, from Dr. Dix, who represents them, and they are complaining that they have been receiving, with the indictment, only one set of the documents on which the indictment is based. It was about 3 feet high for all 21 people. And they felt that this was unfair. They could not prepare an adequate defense. And Justice Jackson says, well, Colonel Story, what do you think we should do? And Justice Jackson sits there, and then Colonel Story says, well, Mr. Justice Jackson, I think we should ignore the whole thing, because we are going to hang most of them anyway, and I think we are wasting a hell of a lot of time and money. I do not know what moved me at that time, but I raised my hand, I got up and said, Mr. Justice Jackson, I agree with Colonel Story that the outcome is undoubtedly what he has predicted. But we are not going to execute the Defense Counsel, and they will be the ones who will decide whether their clients received a fair trial or not. There was a fairly long silence, and suddenly Justice Jackson turns to Colonel Story and says, Colonel Story, will you please call General Clay and tell him to send 2 companies of printers with the printing equipment that is necessary to produce the material that the defendants must have by the end of this week. And then he thinks for a moment longer and says to me, I still stand there, Lieutenant, you made such a valiant plea for the Defense Counsel. Will you now please go over to them and explain to them what we are doing for them and keep them at peace? Thank you very much. I saluted, I made a left turn, I walked over to the Defense Counsel, told them what Justice Jackson had just ordered, and that by the end of the week they would have the documents, but in the meantime, I told them you have to live with what you have, and I don't want you to do any fighting, and I don't want any one of you to hog a document, and so we will lay them all out on benches that I will have brought in, and with each document there is a sheet where you write your name and the time when you got the document, and after the hour is over you better have the document back. Well, these attorneys, altogether I think 20 or 21, they looked at me with surprise. There were more than 21 because practically everyone had 2 assistants. And particularly one of them looked at me with sort of a knowing eye, and finally he couldn't stand the temptation to ask. He got up, walked over to me and said, is it possible that we might have met before, sir? I said, yes. And he walked back. I mean, he was stunned by this very provocative answer that I'd given. Yes. So he walked back after a while and said, would it be possible to know where we have met? I said, yes, I can tell you that too. We were both students in the cram course of Dr. Gellner in Berlin in 1932. Oh, he said, went back. It was Van Papen's son. He was the assistant defense counsel for his father. So at that moment, there was something that I had learned about Justice Jackson that made me forever a person who would believe in that man. And when he ultimately, within a very short time, a month later, gave his speech, he had formulated all of this into a presentation that I think every one of you ought to read and remember, because the language is so pertinent today, where nothing of what Justice Jackson had set into motion, namely participation of the world in the prosecution of aggressive war and crimes against humanity. He had brought in, against his better judgment, because it had to be done that way, he brought in Russians, even though they were as guilty as anybody else. But he brought in the French, the British. He had invited the people in the United Nations. There were 17 nations that had subscribed to it. He saw that the world must be changed to live at peace. And unless we learn how to do this, and it becomes a very difficult thing for America to learn it, because America has found that they always think that they can walk the road alone, but they cannot. It is impossible. And Wilson said, we are going to create the League of Nations. And when he asked the United States to join the League of Nations, the United States said no. And then comes the Second World War, and America joins, organizes the United Nations. And America becomes a member, is still a member, but whenever something is not right, they withhold the funds. They are not working in the United Nations, and they say they don't want to do what we want them to do. Well, the United Nations has to think about the world. And this is what we must learn. And it's a difficult lesson. And you have here in Tower the beginning of something really great, that America's head is turned in the right direction. And Gregory Peterson is the man who is setting this into motion. And I cannot think of anything nicer than having him here and getting this ship to start. Thank you.
Thank you.